It was a quiet Sunday morning in Millfield, Ohio, and the sun had barely begun to stretch its golden arms across the sky. The house smelled of fresh coffee and the warm, comforting aroma of cornbread baking in the oven. But it was the kind of morning that felt different, like something was about to change. I was 14 years old at the time, and life had already taught me a few harsh lessons. Growing up without a father had shaped my world in ways I never fully understood. My mother, Margaret, had always been enough. She was everything to me. Strong, compassionate, and hardworking, she raised me single-handedly, stitching together a life from the threads of her sacrifices. We didn't have much, but we had love, lots of it. And that, to me, was everything. But even love could not fill the empty space left by the man who should have been there. My father, Jack, was a ghost in my life, a figure I knew only from the old faded photograph that Mom kept tucked away. He was a handsome man with a mischievous smile and a cigarette hanging from his lips, leaning against an old Chevy. But that image, as clear as it was just a fragment of a life he chose to abandon. I grew up asking questions I never really got answers to. Why wasn't he around? Why did Mom always speak of him with a mix of anger and longing, but never with the warmth I imagined a father's presence would bring? Why did he leave her to raise me alone? I could only piece together the little bits of information I heard from Mom or my Aunt Judy. He chose the bottle over his family, Edith, Aunt Judy would say when we were alone. Your mother deserved better, but sometimes our hearts choose wrong. I didn't know what to make of that, but it stayed with me. Those words, the sadness in Aunt Judy's voice. And as I grew older, I realized that no matter how much love Mom gave, there was always this emptiness. At school, I watched my friends laugh with their fathers, sit together at the parent-teacher meetings, or see them coach little league games. I would look at them with a mix of jealousy and longing. It wasn't that I didn't love my mother, of course I did. But there was a part of me, a part one tried to bury deep down, that wished for a father. Mom always said he loved his bottle more than responsibility. He left when she was pregnant with me and never looked back. He would disappear for days, then come home only to grab his few belongings and walk out the door. That was the man I never knew. He was a mystery, a shadow from my past that I never understood, never had the chance to. But despite his absence, life went on. We lived simply. We had the bare essentials, but Mom made sure I never felt deprived of love or attention. Her strength was my shield. She worked long hours as a seamstress, fixing hems and stitching together wedding dresses. And when she came home, she would tell me stories, make me laugh, and remind me every single day that even without a father, I was loved. Still, there were moments when I felt that hole, that aching absence. It was there in the silence after a long day when Mom would sit in her chair, stitching away while I sat at her feet, asking her about the man who never was. She would smile and shake her head, telling me to focus on the good, on what we had. But I could never shake the feeling that something, or rather someone, was missing. I remember the first time I asked her point blank, "Mom, why didn't he ever come back?" It was the hardest question I had ever asked, and I was only 7. Her eyes welled up for a second, and she looked away, her hand still busy with the needle. "Edith, I don't have all the answers. But I will always be here for you. That's what matters." I didn't understand it then, but as I grew older I realized what she meant. She was right. What mattered was the love she gave me, even though there was never a man to show me what a father's love was like. Still, the questions lingered, and the hole remained, even though I tried my best to ignore it. Mom worked tirelessly, giving me everything she could. But there were times when I would catch her staring out the window, a faraway look in her eyes. She was always kind to everyone around her, always ready to lend a hand to anyone in need. But I saw the pain in her, the remnants of the man who had walked away from her and from me. It wasn't until that morning, March 17, 1968, that the reality of his absence hit me like a ton of bricks. That day would change everything. I woke up, expecting the usual Sunday routine: fresh coffee, cornbread, and the smell of Mom's favorite perfume. But something was off. When I came downstairs, I found her sitting in the living room, her face streaked with tears. And there he was, Jack. My father. The man I had spent years wondering about. "Who is this man, Mom?" I asked, standing at the top of the stairs, heart pounding in my chest. "This is your father, Edith," she whispered, her voice trembling. That moment, that simple sentence, shattered everything I thought I knew. My father was real. He wasn't just a face in an old photograph. But who was this man in front of me now? The man who had been absent for 14 years? The man who had left us when I was still in my mother's womb? And why was he back now? What followed after that morning would change my life in ways I could never have anticipated. It was the beginning of a nightmare I couldn't have predicted, one that would haunt me for the years to come. But at that moment, as I looked at the man who had given me life but never love, I had no idea how deep the betrayal would go. Life as I knew it was about to shatter piece by piece. As I sit on the porch now, watching the sun dip behind the hills of Millfield, I can't help but think back to those early days with my mother, Helen. It feels like it was just yesterday when I was a little girl, watching her work tirelessly to make sure I never felt the absence of my father. And though I didn't understand it fully back then, now I see how much she sacrificed, how hard she fought to give me a life that didn't feel broken, even though everything around us seemed to be. Helen Wilson, my mother, was one of those women who made sacrifices without a second thought. From the moment my father, Jack, walked out the door, leaving us to fend for ourselves, Mom's world shrank. It became about making sure that her daughter never felt the sting of abandonment. Yet, as a young girl, I could feel the weight of it, the silent struggle that played out in every corner of our home. My mother wasn't the type to complain. I never once heard her say how unfair life was. Her shoulders may have been bent with exhaustion, but her spirit was never broken. Each day she put on a brave face, wrapping herself in the quiet strength that defined her. But it wasn't easy. I saw it in the way her hands trembled when she finished a long day of sewing, the way she would pause before answering the phone, knowing that every bill was one step closer to the edge. But somehow she always made sure we had what we needed, even when I could tell there wasn't much left. Helen worked from sunup to sundown, sewing clothes for the townspeople. The fabric, the threads, and the scissors were like old friends to her, tools she used to weave a life for us, even though it wasn't the one she dreamed of. It was always just the two of us, me and her. I remember the nights when she would hum softly while working by the dim light of the lamp, stitching another dress for Mrs. Jenkins down the street or hemming pants for Mr. Thompson at the hardware store. There were days when the work felt endless, but I never heard her complain. She would just push on, her focus unwavering because she knew that we had to survive. There were times when I felt guilty, watching her wear herself out for my sake. I was only a child, but I saw how tired she was, how her back ached from hours of bending over the sewing machine. She never said it, but I knew the exhaustion she carried in her bones. I remember once asking her, "Mom, why don't we get help? Why don't you ask someone to help you?" And she just smiled a little sadly and said, "We do what we must, Edith, and we never ask for anything we can't give back." As I grew older, I began to understand the magnitude of the sacrifices she made. She worked with a quiet dignity, often taking on extra jobs to make sure I could have the things I needed: school supplies, new shoes, a warm coat for winter. But beyond the physical labor, there was another kind of sacrifice. It was emotional, deep, and unspoken. Helen poured so much love into me that I never realized how much she was holding back. She had to be both the mother and the father. She had to fill the role of protector and provider, but she did so with such grace that I never felt the burden of it. I recall a moment in my teenage years when I had started to question everything. The absence of my father haunted me, and I'd often sit alone in my room, wondering why my mother chose to raise me by herself. It was then that she shared a piece of her heart with me, a story I had never heard before. One evening, as we sat on the back porch, she handed me a cup of tea, her hands a little less steady than before. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of pink and orange, and the air was thick with the scent of jasmine from the garden. "Your father was always good at making promises," she said softly, looking out at the horizon, "but never good at keeping them. I believed in him once, and that was my mistake. But when he left, I realized something. I realized that I could do this on my own. I didn't need him. I had you." I didn't know what to say. I had always seen her as the strong, silent figure who carried the weight of the world without flinching. But in that moment, I saw something more fragile in her eyes, a kind of quiet sorrow that had been buried beneath years of resilience. Even after years of hard work and sacrifice, Helen never stopped giving. And I was so often the recipient of her love, I never truly understood the cost. I can remember her putting me to bed at night, tucking the covers around me with a tenderness that made me feel safe. And in the morning, when the first rays of sunlight would peek through the curtains, she'd already be up, sewing by the light of the lamp, preparing for another long day. There were moments when I thought she was invincible, when I thought she could take on the world without ever needing a break. But I saw it in her tired eyes, in the way her shoulders sagged after a long day. She wasn't invincible, she was human. And yet, despite all the hardships, despite all the struggles, she was the one who never gave up. She was the one who kept going for me. The reality of our lives often hit me hard when I went to school. I saw my classmates come in with lunchboxes packed by their fathers, or hear about the new bikes their dads had bought them for their birthday. I didn't have that. I didn't have someone to fix things around the house, someone to teach me to ride a bike, or someone to give me the reassurance that everything would be okay. But what I did have was a mother who believed in me more than anyone else ever could. I realized then that the sacrifices she made, the late nights, the missed meals, the sleepless nights, all of it was for me. And in some ways I think that was the hardest part for her. She didn't just give me everything she could. She gave up so much of herself. Looking back, I see now that Helen's sacrifices were not just about the material things, though those were important too. They were about her time, her energy, her spirit. They were about the love she poured into every stitch she made, into every meal she cooked, into every word of encouragement she gave. She built our life with so much care, with so much strength, but always with the quiet hope that one day it would be enough. And as I sit here today on this porch in Millfield, Ohio, I realize how lucky I am to have had her as my mother. I realize that the true measure of a person is not found in what they own or what they've gained. It's found in what they're willing to give. And Helen, my dear mother, gave me everything she had. It was a quiet morning when I first saw him again. I had just finished a cup of coffee, sitting at the kitchen table, staring out the window as the sun began to rise over Millfield. My thoughts were lost in memories, half-forgotten moments from the past that always seemed to resurface at the strangest times. But on that morning, as I gazed out over the quiet streets, I saw a figure in the distance, walking slowly toward my house. First, I didn't recognize him, but as he got closer, I saw the familiar broad shoulders, the hunched walk, and that old worn-out jacket that I had once thought was a part of him. Tom. My heart stopped for a moment, and then a flood of emotions rushed through me. Anger, confusion, a strange sense of disbelief. He was back. The man who had walked away from me, from everything we had built together, was standing at the end of my driveway. And suddenly the past, with all its hurt and its pain, came rushing back to me, clearer than ever before. I hadn't seen Tom in over 15 years. 15 years of silence, years where his absence had been as constant as the ticking of the clock. He left when I was still in my 20s, a broken woman. A woman with a child to raise and no support. I had raised our son Jimmy on my own, built a life for the two of us, working tirelessly, trying to fill the hole he had left behind. And though the years had softened some of the edges of that pain, seeing him now, standing there like a ghost, brought all of it rushing back to the surface. I stood up slowly, as if my body didn't quite believe what my eyes were seeing. He was getting closer now, his steps slow, almost tentative. I couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment. This was a man who had once promised me everything and then disappeared without a trace, leaving only the empty space he had vacated. And now, after all this time, he was back asking for what? I watched him walk up the driveway, my heart pounding in my chest. When he reached the porch, he hesitated, his hand hovering over the railing for just a moment before he spoke. "Edith," he said, his voice rough like he hadn't used it in years. "It's me, Tom." His eyes were weary, tired in a way that went beyond age, beyond the years that had passed. He looked different, more worn, but still, there was something in his gaze that made me remember the man I had once loved. But I quickly shook that thought away. This wasn't the man I had once known. That man was a stranger to me now, a ghost. I didn't know what to say. My mouth felt dry, and for a moment I couldn't find the words. The pain, the betrayal. It all seemed so fresh again, like it had never gone away. The years of silence between us, the years of pretending that he didn't matter, suddenly seemed like a lie. It wasn't just that he had left. It was the way he had left.
No explanations. No goodbye.
He had just walked out of our lives, leaving me to pick up the pieces. "What do you want?" I finally managed to say, my voice quiet but firm. "I know it's been a long time," he said. his voice thick with something I couldn't quite place. Regret? Shame? But I need your help, Edith. I don't have anyone else. I felt a knot form in my stomach. Help. After all this time, he thought I would just open my door and let him in like nothing had ever happened? I couldn't just forget, not after everything we had been through. Help with what? I asked, crossing my arms in front of me. You walked away from us, Tom. You walked away from me. And now, after all this time, you come back? Why? I'm sick, he said, his voice growing softer. The doctors say I don't have much time left. He stopped as if gathering his strength. I need somewhere to stay, Edith. I'm not asking for much. Just a place to sleep until I can figure things out. The words hit me like a wave, crashing over me with a force I hadn't been prepared for. I had heard rumors over the years, bits and pieces of gossip from people in town. Some said he'd gotten into trouble with the law. Others said he'd lost everything, that his life had fallen apart. But hearing it from him, hearing it from the man who had once promised to be my partner, made it all too real. I wanted to turn him away, to slam the door and walk away, to pretend like I didn't care. But the truth was I did care. I didn't want to care. But I did. How could I not? He was the father of my son, the man I had loved, the man who had left me to raise our child alone. And now, after all these years, he was standing here asking for help. I looked at him for a long time, trying to make sense of everything, of the emotions swirling inside me. I had built a life without him. I had raised Jimmy on my own, taught him everything he needed to know, been both mother and father. I didn't need Tom. I didn't want him to come back and disrupt the fragile peace I had made for myself. But at the same time, I knew that turning him away wouldn't change anything. It wouldn't fix the past. It wouldn't heal the hurt. Come inside, I said finally, my voice softening. You can stay for a while. But I'm not doing this for you, Tom. I'm doing this because it's the right thing to do. He looked at me for a long moment, as if unsure if I was serious. And then slowly he nodded. Thank you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I won't forget this, Edith. I swear. And just like that, the past seemed to come rushing back. More memories, more emotions, more questions. But now there was one more person in the house, one more ghost from my past, and I couldn't help but wonder. Would his presence heal old wounds or rip them open again? As he stepped inside, I couldn't shake the feeling that this reunion wasn't just about Tom's return. It was about something much bigger, something that would change everything yet again. Letting Tom stay wasn't as easy as I made it sound. Oh no, dear, it came with a price. A price that wasn't just measured in dollars or material things, but in pieces of my heart, my peace of mind, and my trust. When I said yes, when I opened that door to a man who had long been a ghost in my life, I had no idea what I was getting myself into. I wanted to believe that the kindness of offering him a roof over his head would be enough to bridge the chasm of abandonment and hurt between us. But life, it seems, has a way of testing you, and sometimes, just sometimes, it demands more than you're ready to give. Tom moved in on a Tuesday, the air crisp and cool for an early autumn evening. He didn't bring much with him. Just a small worn duffel bag, and a look in his eyes that made me question everything I'd ever known about forgiveness. His condition wasn't great, that was clear. His skin was sallow, his hands trembling as he unpacked the few belongings he had, setting them on the table in the back room that had once belonged to Jimmy when he was younger. His hair, graying with time and neglect, was unkempt, and his eyes, those eyes that had once looked at me with so much love, were now dull, haunted. And I wondered then, was I doing the right thing? But I didn't have time to dwell on my doubts. He was here now, and I had made my choice. My mother always said, "You help people because it's the right thing to do, not because they deserve it." And maybe that was what I was doing, offering help even when it didn't feel right. Maybe deep down I hoped that by offering him a place to stay, I could heal the wounds left by his absence, by his choices. Maybe I was trying to save him from the same loneliness I had known for so long. In those first few days, I did everything I could to make him feel welcome. I brought him a cup of coffee in the morning, helped him with his medication, and made sure he had a warm meal every night. I told myself that I was doing this for the right reasons, that I was doing this out of compassion. But something began to shift as the days wore on, something I couldn't quite put my finger on at first. He was here physically, yes, but emotionally, He seemed to be slipping further and further away from me, like a shadow I couldn't reach. I'd catch him sitting at the kitchen table late at night, staring out the window as if waiting for something, or someone to come. And when I asked him what was on his mind, he'd just shake his head saying, "Nothing, Edith. Just thinking." But I knew better than to believe that. There was something more, something he wasn't telling me. I could feel it in the air between us, thick with unspoken words. A week after he moved in, I found out what that something was. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I was in the living room, sorting through some old family photos. I could hear Tom moving around in the back room, humming softly to himself. It was a strange sound, and for a moment, I let myself imagine that everything might actually turn out okay. That maybe, just maybe, Tom would get better. Maybe we could have a second chance, the family we were always meant to be. But when I went to check on him, I found him sitting on the edge of the bed, holding a half-empty bottle of whiskey in his hands. It was almost full when he arrived. I had hoped he would be able to quit, that he could somehow stay sober with the help I offered, but I was wrong. He was drinking again just like before. And the bitterness in his eyes when he saw me standing in the doorway made something inside me snap. He hadn't even been here a week, and he was already slipping back into old habits. "What are you doing, Tom?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He looked at me with that same defeated expression that seemed to have taken over him entirely. "I need it, Edith. I'm not as strong as you think." The words hit me harder than I wanted them to. I wanted to scream at him, tell him that he had no right to destroy everything he touched, that he had no right to come back into my life just to repeat the same mistakes. But I didn't. I stood there frozen, not knowing what to do. I had spent my entire life caring for others, Jimmy, my mother, the people in town. But I couldn't help him. I realized with a heavy heart that he didn't want my help. He didn't want redemption. What he wanted was to be left alone, to drink away his guilt and his pain, to continue running from the life he had broken. I left the room then, the tears stinging my eyes. I went out to the porch where the cool breeze hit my face, trying to gather my thoughts. How had I ended up here again? Was this truly the life I had imagined for myself? Was this the man I had once loved? The weeks that followed were a blur of emotions. Tom's drinking only worsened, and his behavior became more erratic. He'd stay in his room for days at a time, only emerging when he needed something: food, medicine, attention. It was as if he was a shadow in our house, haunting the corners of my life, taking up space without really living. At times, I would find him sitting in the living room, staring at the TV but not watching it. Other times, he'd sit in silence, his hands shaking, his eyes unfocused. I started to realize that the Tom I remembered, the man who once stood beside me and shared a life together, was gone. In his place was someone who had given up, someone who had lost the battle against his own demons. But I couldn't give up on him, not yet. One night, after dinner, as the silence stretched between us, I spoke up. "Tom, what happened to you?" My voice cracked, a knot forming in my throat. "You had everything. You had a family. You had me." He looked at me then, really looked at me, and for a moment there was a flicker of something: regret, sorrow, guilt in his eyes. He took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling as he prepared himself to speak. "I lost it all, Edith. I lost everything I ever cared about. And it wasn't until I had nothing left that I realized what I'd thrown away. And in that moment I saw the man I had once loved, not the broken stranger who had come to my door, but the man who had once held my hand, who had once promised me the world. It was a fleeting glimpse, but it was enough to make me understand. Tom hadn't just lost everything because of his drinking. He had lost everything because he had never believed he deserved it in the first place. He had never believed that he could have a good life, that he could be happy. And that belief had slowly eaten away at him, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but emptiness. And so I made a choice. I couldn't force him to change, but I could offer him the space to do it on his own. I could help him by showing him that he still had a chance, that he still had a family who cared. I told him, through the tears and the hurt, that he was welcome to stay as long as he needed to get better. But I made it clear that he had to take responsibility for his actions. I couldn't carry him. I had my own life to rebuild, my own dreams to follow. But I would be there to support him, if he chose to fight for himself. That was the price of compassion, you see. It wasn't about saving him. It wasn't about fixing what was broken. It was about giving him the chance to heal, and in turn healing myself. It was about understanding that sometimes love isn't about fixing the other person. It's about letting them fix themselves with you by their side, cheering them on when they can't do it alone. And so Tom stayed. He stayed in the back room and I stayed in my own space. And day by day we both tried to rebuild piece by piece the lives we had almost lost. It's strange how abuse doesn't always begin with loud explosions or dramatic confrontations. No, it often starts quietly, creeping into the corners of life like a shadow. At first it's easy to dismiss, just a rough day, just a slip-up, just one more thing that doesn't quite feel right but doesn't seem like much at all. I've learned over the years that abuse doesn't announce itself in the way you might expect. It isn't a sudden storm, but rather the first raindrops in a long, slow downpour. When Tom first moved in with us, I told myself it was a new beginning. The man I had once loved, however flawed, however broken, was back in my life. I had forgiven him, or at least I tried to, and I had hoped that his return would be a chance for reconciliation. He was sick, after all, and no matter how many years had passed, I couldn't turn my back on him in his time of need. I had grown up hearing stories about people coming back from the brink of their own despair, from addiction, from mistakes. Perhaps this was his chance to redeem himself. The first few days were peaceful enough. We had long talks like we used to before everything fell apart. I told him about my life, my children, and he listened, his tired eyes flickering with interest. He even tried to help around the house, fixing small things here and there. Leaky faucets, broken windows, acts of care that seemed to signal the start of something better. And for a moment, just a moment, I allowed myself to believe that maybe he had changed, that perhaps all the pain and heartache he had caused us could be forgiven. But deep down I knew better. There was a part of me that kept watching, observing. I had been hurt before, and I wasn't about to let my guard down completely. Slowly I began to notice small things, tiny shifts in his behavior, that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. For one, there was his growing irritability. At first it was just a small thing. Slamming a door a little too hard, muttering under his breath when things didn't go as he expected. But it started to escalate. He would snap at me for the smallest reasons, his patience wearing thin with the most trivial of issues. If the dinner wasn't exactly to his liking, he'd grumble and leave the table without a word. If the house wasn't clean to his standard, something I always took great pride in, he would make a snide remark followed by an uncomfortable silence. First I brushed it off. He's just tired, I tell myself. It's the illness, it's the medication. He's been through a lot. But after a while I couldn't ignore the uncomfortable tension in the air. It wasn't just the occasional outburst. It was the underlying tone that began to creep into every conversation. He wasn't just irritated anymore. He was short with me. His words were sharper, his demands more frequent, and the looks in his eyes? They were harder, colder, like he was seeing me less as a person and more as an obstacle standing in his way. And then, there was the physical space between us that started to shrink. It's strange, really, how a small shift in the way someone looks at you, or the way they step a little too close, can make you feel more uncomfortable than any harsh words ever could. I noticed that when he passed me in the hallway, his shoulder would brush mine just a little too much, his hand lingering near my arm as if testing the boundaries. It wasn't overt, but it was enough to make my skin crawl. And when I tried to distance myself to keep the space I needed to feel safe, he'd get defensive. "Don't be so distant, Edith," he'd say, his voice low and a little too insistent. "I'm just trying to talk to you. What's wrong with that?" The way he said it made me feel guilty for feeling uncomfortable, as if I was the one in the wrong for wanting my own space. It wasn't until one evening, when I found myself standing in the kitchen preparing dinner, that the full weight of the situation hit me. I had asked Tom for some help with the dishes as I always did, but this time his response was different. He didn't just refuse, he became angry. His face flushed with frustration, his hands clenched into fists by his sides. "Why can't you do anything by yourself?" he snapped, his voice rising in volume. "I'm the one who's sick, and I'm the one who's trying to get better, but you're always asking me for help like I'm still the same man I was before." The harshness of his words took me by surprise. I tried to apologize, to calm him down, but his anger had already taken root. He began pacing back and forth in the kitchen, muttering to himself, and I could see the strain in his face, the weight of whatever was haunting him, pressing down harder than ever. The door slammed as he left the room, and I stood there frozen, my hands shaking with the fear that had crept up on me. That's when I knew. The quiet storm was brewing. The first signs of abuse, subtle, almost imperceptible, were beginning to show. It wasn't the violence of a raised hand or the cruelty of physical injury. Not yet. But it was the emotional manipulation. The way he would try to twist my words and make me feel guilty for things I had no control over. It was the coldness that had replaced the man who had once cared for me. The man who had promised to be my partner. That man was slipping away. Replaced by someone who seemed less and less like the person I had hoped to see, and more like a stranger I didn't know how to deal with. I began to distance myself from him, spending more time in my room, taking longer walks outside, doing anything to avoid being alone with him. The weight of the tension in the house was becoming unbearable, and my mind started racing, wondering what would happen next. Would the anger escalate? Would the bruises show? Was I just waiting for the storm to hit, or had it already begun, quietly and without warning? It's hard to say exactly when things cross the line, when the abuse becomes something undeniable. For me, it was when I realized I was no longer seeing Tom for who he was, but for what he had become, a reflection of all the things I had tried to forget, a mirror of the damage done by years of choices, regrets, and mistakes. The next few days were a blur of anxious glances, terse words, and moments of unbearable silence. I started to retreat more and more into myself, trying to hold on to the woman I had been before everything changed. The woman who had known the joy of independence, the warmth of self-reliance. I wanted to protect that part of me, but I didn't know how. How could I protect myself when the person who had caused the most pain in my life was someone I had once called my partner? But what I learned in those quiet moments of uncertainty was that the early signs of abuse, those warning bells that I ignored, were my best chance at reclaiming my power. Recognizing those shifts in behavior, that fear in my gut, was the first step toward seeing the situation for what it truly was. Not a man in need of help, but a man who had taken far more than I was willing to give. It was time to make a choice. Would I allow this to continue, to allow myself to be manipulated and controlled by the man I once loved? Or would I take a stand and protect the parts of me that were worth saving? I knew the answer, even if it was the hardest decision I'd ever have to make. And it was time for me to take that first step. It's a strange thing, realizing that a moment you once thought was just a bad day can, in hindsight, become the turning point of your life. Before the first major outburst, I hadn't fully understood just how much I had been ignoring. How could I? In those early days, Tom's anger had always been like a storm on the horizon, distant, barely visible, something I could pretend wasn't coming. But storms, as we all know, don't stay on the horizon forever. Sooner or later they reach you. I had noticed the warning signs before, of course. Little things. The sharp edge in his voice when he was frustrated. The way his eyes seemed to narrow when I asked for something, anything. The sudden silence that would follow when I walked into a room, as if he had been thinking about something he didn't want to share. But I told myself, he's sick. He's trying. He's been through so much. I was holding on to the faint hope that somehow things would change. But deep down I knew better. It wasn't until that evening, when everything shifted, that I realized how deep the anger really ran. It was just a regular evening at first. We were all gathered around the dinner table, the clink of silverware filling the room, the soft hum of the evening as usual. But something was different. Tom was quiet in a way that felt wrong. His shoulders were tense, his gaze fixed on his plate. I could feel the weight of his silence like a heavy blanket in the room, suffocating the space that had once been filled with warmth and laughter. I asked him what was wrong, as I had done so many times before, but this time when he looked up at me, his expression was cold. "It's nothing," he muttered, looking away again. But the words were clipped sharp. Too sharp. I knew better than to push him further that evening, but the nagging feeling that something wasn't right only grew stronger. It wasn't long before the tension boiled over. It started with something small, something trivial, as most explosive arguments do. He had asked for seconds of potatoes, and when I didn't respond immediately, he snapped. "I asked for more potatoes," he barked, his voice rising. "Why can't you do anything right?" The harshness in his voice startled me. I froze for a moment, unsure of how to react. My instincts screamed at me to stay calm, to not make it worse. But how could I remain calm when every word he spoke was like a slap across my face? "I'll get them right now, Tom," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, but my hands were shaking. But the more I tried to appease him, the angrier he seemed to get. His eyes narrowed, his jaw clenched, and before I knew it, he was standing up, knocking over his chair in the process. "You never listen." His voice cracked with frustration, each word more venomous than the last. "Always so focused on your damn sewing, your damn plants. Never me. Never what I need." I felt a rush of heat in my chest, part frustration, part fear. It wasn't just the words anymore. It was the tone, the rage building in his voice. The room, once cozy and warm, felt suddenly too small, too tight. "You're not a child, Edith," he continued, taking a step toward me, his voice rising. "I shouldn't have to ask for your attention. You're a grown woman, but you act like I'm some inconvenience to you." I tried to stay calm, tried to step away from the table, but he closed the space between us with one long stride. His breath was heavy, his body tense. I could feel the heat radiating from him, and every muscle in my body screamed for me to leave, to escape, to run. "You're a coward," I whispered, more to myself than to him. The words slipped out before I could stop them, but I knew deep down that they were true. His eyes flashed. "What did you just say?" His voice was low, dangerous now. I didn't have time to respond before his hand shot out, grabbing my wrist with a force that shocked me. It wasn't the first time I'd felt his grip on me. There had been other times when he'd been frustrated, angry, but this was different. There was something in his eyes now that I hadn't seen before. A wildness, a desperation. "You think I'm a coward?" he spat, his grip tightening until I gasped in pain. "You think you can talk to me like that?" I could hardly breathe. The pain in my wrist, the terror in his voice, it felt like everything was closing in on me. My mind raced, my body frozen in place. "Tom," I pleaded, my voice trembling. "Please just let go." But he didn't. His eyes were unfocused, his face twisted with anger and something else I couldn't place, regret, maybe, or guilt, but the fury was so overwhelming that it drowned everything else out. And then in one swift motion, he shoved me backward, sending me crashing into the wall with a force that knocked the wind out of me. I staggered, my back aching from the impact, but there was no time to recover. He was on me again, his face inches from mine, his breath ragged. I thought for a second that I might pass out from the shock. But I stayed upright. Somehow I stayed standing. It was the last shred of my will to survive, to stay alive, to get through this. For a moment there was nothing but silence. His heavy breathing, my own labored exhale. We stood there, facing each other, two people trapped in a moment neither of us wanted but couldn't escape. Then, just as quickly as the rage had appeared, it disappeared. His grip on me loosened, his posture slumped, and the anger faded into something I couldn't name. "I'm sorry," he mumbled, stepping away, his voice weak. "I didn't mean to. I stood there, rooted to the spot, unsure of what to say. His apology, if it could even be called that, was as empty as the apology he had given years ago when he left us. But this time I didn't need to hear his excuse. This time I understood. The illusion of change had shattered. I had been so foolish to think things would be different, that Tom was anything more than the man who had abandoned us in the first place. "Don't apologize," I said, my voice calm, though my heart was still racing. "It's too late for that." I watched him stumble away from me, the weight of the situation sinking in. I had known all along that things wouldn't change. And now here we were at the breaking point. The anger, the fear, the broken promises, it was all too much. But this time I didn't run. I stood my ground. I had to. As I sat down on the edge of the couch, trying to steady my breath, I realized something. This wasn't the end of the story, but the beginning of something I hadn't been prepared for. The moment had come for me to decide how much longer I could allow this behavior in my life. No more waiting for the man I loved to return. No more excuses. The first major outburst had come, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. The question wasn't about him anymore, it was about me. How long would I let him destroy everything I had left? It's a hard thing to admit, but sometimes love can blind us to the truth. It can make us turn a blind eye to what's happening right in front of us. All because we don't want to face the reality of what's wrong. That was the struggle Lily faced as she tried to balance loyalty to her family with the undeniable fear growing in her chest. Lily had always been the kind of person who wanted to believe in the goodness of others. She had grown up in a small town where loyalty was everything, where family was supposed to be the bedrock of your life, the unshakable foundation that everything else was built on. But as the months passed with Tom in the house, Lily began to feel that foundation shift beneath her feet, like the earth itself was giving way. The signs had been there all along. The subtle changes in Tom's behavior, how he would sometimes lash out over the smallest things, his temper flaring when he didn't get his way. At first, Lily had chalked it up to the stresses of his health, the toll the years of drinking had taken on him. She wanted to believe that he could change, that the man who had once loved her mother could come back from the brink, that the remorse he seemed to feel could heal the wounds he had caused. But the fear crept in slowly at first, then all at once. Lily started noticing how Tom would watch her from across the room when no one was looking, his eyes cold and calculating. Sometimes when their eyes met, she felt like he could see straight through her, as if he knew her every thought, every fear. It made her uncomfortable, made her want to shrink away. And every time she tried to talk to her mother about it, she was met with the same response. "He's sick, Lily. He's trying. We have to help him." Her loyalty to her mother kept her quiet, kept her from confronting the uncomfortable truth that was building in her gut. She wanted to believe, to hope, that Tom's return wasn't a mistake, that he had truly changed. But deep down, a voice inside her kept whispering, "He's not the man you remember. He's not the man you want him to be." One afternoon, Lily was sitting in the living room, her sketchbook open in front of her, doodling absent-mindedly while watching the light filter through the curtains. It was one of those quiet, peaceful days that Lily cherished, where the world outside seemed far away. But the peace was short-lived. Tom had been drinking again. Lily could tell by the way he stumbled into the room, his breath thick with whiskey, his movements jerky, as if every step was a struggle. Her mother had been gone for a few hours, visiting a neighbor to drop off some clothes she had finished altering. It was just the two of them in the house. "Lily," Tom called out to her, his voice unsteady, his eyes glassy. "Lily, come here." She didn't want to go to him. She didn't want to be in that space with him alone, especially not when he was like this. But she couldn't refuse him, not when he said her name with that tone, the one that always made her feel guilty for not giving him attention. It was like a command wrapped in a plea. Reluctantly, she stood up and walked toward him, her heart pounding in her chest. The closer she got, the more the air seemed to tighten around her, like she was stepping into a trap she couldn't escape from. Tom sat slouched on the couch, staring at her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "Sit," he said, motioning for her to take the seat next to him. Lily hesitated, but she complied. His hand reached out, brushing against hers as she sat down, and she flinched instinctively. But Tom didn't seem to notice or didn't care. "I don't understand you, Lily," he said softly, his breath heavy. "You used to be so close to me, you know? So willing to help, so eager to make things right." Lily tried to pull her hand away, but he tightened his grip, his fingers digging into her skin in a way that sent a shiver of discomfort through her body. She forced herself to keep her voice steady. "I'm just trying to understand, Tom. What's going on with you? You're different now." Tom's eyes narrowed, his grip tightening for a moment before he relaxed. "I'm different? You think I'm different? You're the one who's different," he spat, his voice rising. "You're the one who's changed, all high and mighty now, like you're better than me." Lily's heart raced. She hadn't meant to upset him, hadn't meant to say the wrong thing. But something about the way he said it, the venom in his words, made her feel like she was standing on the edge of a cliff. One wrong move and she'd fall. "I don't think I'm better than you, Tom," she said, her voice shaking despite her attempts to remain calm. "But you've been drinking again. You're not the man who walked into this house months ago. I'm scared, Tom. I'm scared of what you're becoming." The words were out before she could stop them, and as soon as they left her mouth, she regretted them. Tom's expression shifted in an instant. The anger on his face deepened, his features contorting with rage. "Scared?" he sneered. "You're scared of me? You think I'm some kind of monster?" Lily opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, Tom's hand shot out, grabbing her by the arm with surprising strength. She gasped, feeling a flash of panic rise in her chest. He pulled her toward him roughly, his breath hot against her face. "No one is scared of me, Lily," he hissed, his voice low and dangerous. "You hear me? No one. You're just like your mother. Always thinking you can fix everything. Always thinking you can control me. Well, you can't. No one can." Lily tried to pull away, but his grip was unyielding. Her heart hammered in her chest as she realized just how far gone Tom really was. This wasn't the man who had walked back into her life with apologies and promises. This was a stranger. Someone she didn't know, someone she couldn't trust. The world seemed to spin around her, her vision blurring as the reality of the situation hit her like a ton of bricks. She was alone with him in this room, no one to help, no one to hear her if things got worse. She had let herself believe that things could change, that Tom could be the father she'd never had. But now it was clear that was a lie. She managed to wrench her arm free, backing away from him with shaky steps. "I'm leaving," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "I'm not staying here with you. Not like this." Tom's expression flickered for a moment, almost like he was surprised by her words. But then that surprise was replaced by something darker, something far more frightening. He stood up, his body towering over her, his eyes wild. "No," he growled. "You're not going anywhere. You're not going anywhere without me." And just like that, Lily's entire world shifted once again. The man she had tried so hard to help, the man she had wanted to trust, had turned into someone unrecognizable, someone dangerous. And now she realized she was trapped. In that moment, all of the love and loyalty she had once felt for him vanished. The only thing that mattered now was her own safety, and finding a way out of this nightmare before it was too late. The days following Lily's confrontation with Tom were filled with a heavy silence, a tension that hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. For the first time, Lily truly understood the danger Tom posed. The man who had returned into their lives, asking for forgiveness and offering promises of change, was no longer the same person. He had become someone unrecognizable, someone capable of actions she could no longer ignore. Tom had always been an unpredictable presence in the house. At first, his return had felt like a desperate plea for redemption. But the more Lily observed him, the more she realized that his words didn't match his actions. He was still a man consumed by his demons, and those demons had never really gone away. Tom had a way of twisting reality, of manipulating the people around him. He could be charming when he needed to be, softening his voice and offering apologies. But those moments of vulnerability were fleeting, disappearing as quickly as they had come. When he wasn't apologizing or pleading for forgiveness, he was unpredictable, volatile, always on the edge of a violent outburst. And each time Lily felt herself pulling further and further away. The warning signs were there, of course. His increasing irritability, the way he snapped at Lily and her mother over the smallest of things, the late-night rants that seemed to have no cause, the way he would lash out when things didn't go his way. Lily had hoped with all her heart that it was just a phase, that once he was settled, once he had the support he needed, he would turn a corner. But as each day passed, the cracks in Tom's facade grew wider. It was a Saturday afternoon when the final blow came. The day that would change Lily's life forever. Tom had been quiet that morning, unusually so, and for a moment, Lily thought that perhaps he was finally finding peace. He had been drinking less, eating better, and there was a slight softness to his demeanor that made Lily think, maybe he is changing. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was brewing beneath the surface. Something terrible. Something that she wouldn't be able to avoid forever. The day started like any other. Lily had spent the morning at the local farmer's market, picking up fresh vegetables and flowers for the house. When she returned, she found her mother, Margaret, in the kitchen, humming softly as she prepared lunch. The smell of roasted chicken filled the air, and for a brief moment, Lily felt like everything was normal again. But that fleeting sense of comfort was shattered when Tom walked into the room. He didn't say a word at first, his presence filling the room like a storm cloud. Lily could feel the change in the atmosphere instantly. He was staring at her, his eyes dark and unfocused, and for the first time she saw a flash of something terrifying, something almost predatory in his gaze. "Lily," he said, his voice cold and rough. "I need to talk to you." Lily's heart skipped a beat. She had tried to avoid these moments, tried to ignore the growing tension between them. But now she couldn't run anymore. She followed him into the living room, trying to keep her calm, trying to hold on to the semblance of control that had slipped from her grasp more times than she cared to admit. Tom stood in front of the window, looking out at the garden, but Lily could feel his eyes on her. She sat down on the couch, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her breath shallow as she waited for him to speak. She could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on her. "I'm tired of being treated like I'm the bad guy, Lily," Tom said, his voice tight with frustration. "I've tried, I really have. But I'm sick of being pushed around by everyone. I'm sick of feeling like I don't matter." Lily opened her mouth to respond, to try and calm him, but before she could, he turned around sharply, his hand coming down hard on the armrest of the chair, startling her. "You think you're better than me, don't you?" he spat, his voice rising. "You think you're smarter, you think you've got it all figured out, but you don't know a damn thing about me." Lily froze, her breath caught in her throat. She had never seen him like this, not so angry, so out of control. His words were like venom, and they stung deeper than she ever imagined they could. "No, Tom," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't think I'm better than you. I just want you to be better. We want you to be better. But you can't keep doing this. You can't keep pushing us away." But Tom wasn't listening. His face twisted with rage, and before Lily could react, he lunged at her, his hands grabbing her by the shoulders with such force that it knocked the breath out of her. She gasped, her body going rigid, her mind racing as she tried to push him away. The strength in his hands was overpowering, and she felt her heart race as she struggled beneath him. "Lily, you don't get it," he yelled, shaking her. "You don't understand what it's like to be me. I've given everything for this family, and what do I get in return? Nothing." In that moment, Lily realized just how far gone he was. This wasn't a man looking for redemption. This was a man consumed by his own insecurities, his own bitterness, and he was taking it out on the people who had tried to help him. Her mother heard the commotion from the kitchen and rushed in, her face filled with alarm. "Tom, stop," Margaret cried, rushing to pull him off Lily. But Tom shoved her away, his strength surprising both of them. "You stay out of this, Margaret," he shouted. "This is between me and Lily." Lily, still struggling beneath him, felt tears welling up in her eyes. She was scared. She was terrified. She had never seen him this violent, this dangerous, and she didn't know what to do. She had never felt so helpless. It wasn't until her mother screamed, "Tom, please, not like this, not with her," that he finally stopped. He pulled away from Lily, his face flushed with anger and shame. He stood there, panting, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Lily pushed herself up off the floor, her body shaking with fear and adrenaline. She couldn't look at him anymore. She couldn't even breathe in the same room as him without feeling like she might suffocate. She backed away slowly, trying to distance herself from the man who had once been her father, trying to distance herself from the monster he had become. "Leave," she whispered, barely able to get the words out. "I can't do this anymore." Tom didn't argue. He didn't fight her on it. He just turned, his shoulders hunched, and walked out of the room. Lily watched him go, her heart heavy with sorrow and confusion. What had happened to the man she once hoped could change? What had happened to the man who had promised to do better? Her mother stood in the doorway, her face pale, her hands trembling. She didn't know what to say. She didn't know how to make it right. All she could do was look at Lily, as if silently asking for forgiveness for bringing him back into their lives. Lily didn't have an answer for her. She didn't have any answers at all. She only knew one thing for sure. Her world had just been shattered, and there was no going back. The days that followed were filled with tension and silence. Tom stayed away, leaving Lily and her mother to pick up the pieces of what had happened. But the damage was already done. The lines had been crossed, the trust broken, and for Lily there was no way to rebuild it. The man who had once been her father was gone, replaced by a violent, unpredictable stranger. And as she tried to process everything that had happened, she realized that it wasn't just Tom who had changed. She had changed too. She had learned the hard way that sometimes love wasn't enough to fix everything. Sometimes you had to protect yourself even if it meant letting go of the people you once loved. And in that painful lesson, Lily found the strength to walk away from the person who had tried to destroy her. The days that followed Tom's violent outbursts were some of the longest and hardest of Lily's life. The silence in the house was deafening, and it felt as though the walls themselves were closing in on her. She had never thought she would find herself in this situation, forced to deal with a monster who had once been a father figure in her life. But now, after everything, she was left with no choice but to confront the ugly truth. Tom was no longer the man he had once been. In the weeks following that fateful day, Lily became more and more anxious. She spent her nights lying awake, staring at the ceiling, her heart racing at every creak in the floorboards, at every whisper of wind against the windows. She no longer felt safe in her own home. The place that had once been a sanctuary, a refuge from the outside world, now felt like a prison, a place where fear and anxiety ruled every moment. Her mother, Margaret, did her best to keep the peace, trying to maintain a semblance of normality. She would talk about the garden, about the flowers she was growing, or the new recipes she had tried. But no matter how hard she tried to distract Lily, the tension was always there, hanging in the air like a storm cloud waiting to break. Tom had not changed. If anything, he had become more unpredictable, more dangerous. Lily knew it was only a matter of time before Tom would snap again. It wasn't just the way he had looked at her, that cold, empty gaze he had when he was angry. It was the way he had reacted to the slightest provocation, the way he had pushed her mother aside without a second thought. There was no reasoning with him. There was no making him understand. He was a man who had chosen the bottle over everything else, and now it was as though that bottle had taken his soul with it. One evening, as Lily sat in the living room, trying to distract herself with a book, she heard Tom's footsteps approaching. Her stomach churned with dread. The sound of his steps, slow and deliberate, seemed to echo through the house. She knew it was him before he even appeared in the doorway. She didn't have to look up to know that he was there. The air around her grew colder, and her heartbeat quickened. "Lily," he said, his voice hoarse, "I need to talk to you." She froze. She couldn't bring herself to face him. She had heard those words before, and each time, it had only led to more manipulation, more violence. She knew what would come next. Promises of change, empty apologies that meant nothing. He was never going to change. She had to leave. She had to get out. "I don't want to talk to you, Tom," she said, her voice trembling. "I've had enough. I can't keep pretending this is normal. You're not the man you used to be." He didn't respond at first. He just stood there looking at her with those empty eyes, and for a moment, she saw the man she once knew, the father figure who had been part of her life, even if from a distance. But that was all gone now. In his place stood a stranger, a monster who had destroyed her mother and now threatened to do the same to her. "You don't get it, do you?" he said, taking a step closer. "I've been trying to fix things." "I'm trying, Lily." She shook her head, standing up and backing away from him.
No, Tom.
"You're not trying. You've had every chance. You've hurt my mother, and now you're hurting me. I'm done." That was when she made the decision. She couldn't stay. She couldn't keep living in fear. She had to get out, and she had to do it fast. If she stayed, it would only get worse. Tom's apologies and promises were nothing more than traps, designed to keep her in his web of control. She needed to escape. For her own safety, for her own sanity, she needed to break free. Lily didn't waste any time. She grabbed the small bag she kept hidden in the back of her closet, one she had packed just in case. It wasn't much, just a few changes of clothes, a couple of toiletries, and the little bit of cash she had saved up from her part-time job at the local diner. But it was enough to get her out of the house and to the next step. Her heart raced as she crept through the darkened house, trying to make as little noise as possible. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet, each sound making her jump. She could hear Tom's voice muffled through the walls, but she couldn't afford to wait. She had to leave now. As she reached the front door, she paused for a moment, her hand on the doorknob. She looked back at the house, at the place where she had spent most of her life, where her mother had raised her, where the nightmares had started. It felt like leaving a piece of her heart behind, but she knew it was the only way to survive. She opened the door as quietly as possible, stepping into the night air. The cool breeze hit her face, and for a moment, she felt like she could breathe again. She didn't know where she was going, but that didn't matter. She had to get away. The streets were quiet at this hour, the world still asleep. Lily walked quickly, her footsteps echoing in the silence. She didn't look back, didn't stop to think about what she was leaving behind. All she knew was that she couldn't go back. She couldn't face Tom again. She couldn't live in fear anymore. She reached the bus stop at the edge of town, her heart still pounding in her chest. The bus would be there soon, and once she was on it, she would be free, at least for a while. She would figure out the next step later. But for now, escaping Millfield, escaping Tom was all that mattered. As the bus approached, Lily felt a mix of relief and fear wash over her. She didn't know what the future held, but she was ready to face it. She was ready to live her life on her own terms, away from the man who had stolen so much from her. And as she boarded the bus and sat down by the window, looking out at the dark, empty streets of Millfield one last time, she felt a glimmer of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep her going. She was free, and for the first time in a long time, she was going to be okay. In that moment, Lily knew one thing for certain. She had survived, and she would continue to survive, no matter what came next. Lily's escape from the clutches of Tom was only the beginning of her journey toward freedom. The night she left Millfield behind, she didn't just leave a house. She left behind a lifetime of fear, pain, and shattered trust. But she knew that escaping was only the first step. What followed was the most difficult part. Seeking help. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about reclaiming her life, rebuilding it from the ground up, and ensuring that the terror she had endured would never return. When Lily boarded the bus, there was a sense of relief that washed over her. But it was also mixed with uncertainty. The world beyond Millfield was vast, and she had no idea where to go. She needed to contact the authorities, but she also feared that, without evidence or support, her story would seem too unbelievable. How could she, a young girl, expect anyone to take her seriously? How could she possibly prove the extent of the abuse she had lived through when Tom's hold on her life had been so suffocating, so manipulative? Lily didn't know the answers to these questions, but she knew one thing for sure. She had to try. She had to fight for herself, and for every other woman and child who had ever been in a similar situation, silenced by fear, ashamed to speak out, afraid of the consequences. That night, as she rode the bus, she gathered her courage and made a plan to reach out for help once and for all. After she arrived in the nearby town of Riverside, Lily went straight to a public phone booth. Her hands were shaking as she dialed the number she had memorized. The local police department. It felt like the longest few seconds of her life before the line picked up. Riverside Police Department, how can I help you? The dispatcher's voice was calm, professional, but Lily could hear the kindness underneath, and it gave her a small sense of relief. Hello, my name is Lily and I need help. I just left my home in Millfield. Lily's voice cracked as the weight of the words finally hit her. She was free, but the pain was still so raw. She paused for a moment, collecting her thoughts. The dispatcher waited patiently, then prompted. It's okay, take your time. Can you tell me what happened, Lily? Taking a deep breath, Lily spoke. She told the dispatcher everything, about Tom's return after years of absence, the violence that had escalated in their home, and how she had finally managed to escape the night before. She explained how Tom had become increasingly erratic, the way his behavior had shifted from strange to outright dangerous. She spoke of the slap he had delivered to her mother, and how that had shattered any illusion of normalcy left in the house. The dispatcher was attentive and kind, offering reassurances, but Lily could hear the urgency in her voice as well. Lily, I'm going to have an officer come by and check on you. Are you in a safe place right now? I'm at the bus station, Lily replied. But I don't know where to go. I don't know who to trust. I don't want to go back to Millfield. I just want to make sure I'm not alone anymore. You're not alone, Lily. We're going to help you. Stay right there, okay? An officer will be there shortly. Lily hung up the phone and sank onto a bench, feeling the weight of everything crashing down on her. She wasn't sure how long it would take for the officer to arrive, but she knew she couldn't just sit there forever. Her mind raced, thinking about the legal system and how the authorities might handle this. Would they believe her? Would they be able to stop Tom before he could hurt anyone else? About 30 minutes later, a police car pulled up to the station. Lily's heart skipped a beat as the officer stepped out, a tall man in his 40s with a no-nonsense demeanor. He was kind, though, and introduced himself as Officer Miller. You're Lily, right? he asked gently. I'm Officer Miller. I've been told you need some help. Lily nodded, her throat tight. Yes. I don't know what to do. I can't go back there. My mom, she's gone. The officer nodded, his expression softening. I'm so sorry to hear that, Lily. We'll take care of everything. You're not alone anymore. You did the right thing by reaching out. Let's talk, okay? With Officer Miller's guidance, Lily was taken to a local safe house for women in Riverside. It was an unassuming building, nothing too flashy, but it was a place where women like her, women escaping violence, could find refuge. The women there were kind, welcoming, and ready to help Lily navigate the next steps. The first night in the safe house was a blur. There were meals to eat, paperwork to fill out, and an intake process that felt overwhelming. But Lily was grateful for the quiet, for the peace, and for the sense that someone finally was looking out for her. The following days were filled with more meetings with social workers and law enforcement officers. Lily was assigned a counselor named Helen, a woman in her late 30s who had been working with survivors of domestic violence for years. Helen was warm and empathetic, and she became a constant presence in Lily's life, guiding her through the legal steps of filing a restraining order against Tom and offering emotional support as Lily navigated the trauma she had experienced. Helen explained the process of reporting the abuse to social services and how the authorities would gather evidence to build a case against Tom. You're doing the right thing by speaking up, Lily, she reassured her one afternoon. This is how we stop the cycle of abuse, not just for you, but for others who might be suffering in silence. Lily had never imagined her life would take this turn. The girl who had once been so shy, so uncertain, was now taking control of her own fate. She was reporting the abuse, she was receiving help, and she was slowly rebuilding her life. But there was still a long way to go. Lily didn't know if the authorities would catch Tom right away or if he would run, but she knew one thing for sure. She was not alone anymore. With the help of Officer Miller, Helen, and the safe house staff, she was learning how to navigate a world that had once seemed so intimidating and cold. Lily's courage was bolstered by the knowledge that in reaching out for help, she was not just securing her own future, but perhaps helping others in the same situation. By reporting her story, she was showing others that it was possible to fight back. She was giving them the courage to speak out and seek justice, just as she had done. Weeks passed and Lily's case was moving through the legal system. Police had located Tom's whereabouts, and with the help of the social services team, they were able to prepare a comprehensive case against him. He was arrested for his actions, and the evidence was enough to secure his conviction for the abuse he had subjected both Lily and her mother to. It wasn't an easy process. There were difficult moments, painful reminders of the trauma, but Lily found strength in the support of the people around her. Lily's story became a beacon of hope for others who were in similar situations. It was proof that no matter how dark it seemed, there was a way out. By reaching out to the authorities and getting the help she needed, she had changed the course of her life and taken the first steps toward healing. Her journey wasn't over yet, but she had finally learned that, no matter what, she was worthy of a better life. A life without fear, without pain, and without Tom. And with every step she took, she was reclaiming her power and her freedom one day at a time. The days leading up to the trial felt like the longest of my life. As I sat in the courtroom with my hands clasped tightly in my lap, my heart seemed to beat in my throat. It wasn't just the fear of facing Tom again. It was the weight of what had happened. The years of pain, confusion, and fear. But it wasn't only my story that was being told anymore. It was the truth, a truth that needed to be said, no matter how hard it was to hear. The trial was set, and for the first time I knew I had to face my past. I had to look at the man who had torn my world apart, and I had to do it in front of a room full of strangers, all of whom would judge the things he had done to me, to us. When Tom entered the courtroom, it was as if the air in the room grew heavier. I couldn't help but feel a wave of nausea hit me. There he was, the man who had promised to protect me, the one who should have been my protector, yet he had become the very thing I had feared. Tom, now a man broken by his own addiction and demons, looked nothing like the father figure I had hoped he would become. His appearance seemed to confirm what I already knew. He wasn't just physically sick. He was a man who had long ago lost his humanity. My mother, Helen, sat beside me in the front row, her hand gently squeezing mine, offering a quiet support that I had come to rely on. This was her fight too. Even though she had tried so hard to shield me from the ugliness of our lives. The pain of hearing Tom's name, knowing how much he had betrayed us both, was written all over her face. But this was it, this was our moment to be heard. The first day of the trial was filled with painful memories. My attorney, a kind woman named Susan, walked me through my testimony step by step. She was gentle with her questions, careful not to push too hard. But the memories kept flooding in anyway. I spoke about the first time I realized that something wasn't right with Tom. How he had come back into our lives after years of absence, appearing at the front door like a lost soul, asking for help, his voice weak and apologetic. He had promised my mother everything would be different, that his return meant he was going to change, that he would be the father I had always wanted. But I also spoke about the anger I felt when I realized that he wasn't going to change. I spoke about the first slap I received, the first verbal insult that tore down the protective walls I had built around myself. I told them about how, little by little, Tom began to take control of our lives. How his need to dominate, to belittle, and to hurt slowly seeped into every moment of our days. His promises became empty, and his love was always tainted with manipulation. He always told us that he was doing it all for our good, that his cruelty was justified. The memories of his rages, the moments when he would drink too much and become unrecognizable, came rushing back with every word I spoke. But it was hard to speak these truths aloud, especially in front of so many people. I remember hearing the murmurs from the gallery, the gasps as they heard how deeply Tom had hurt us. It wasn't just the physical abuse, it was the emotional manipulation that really scarred me. The gaslighting that made me question my own memories, the isolation that made me feel like I was losing my mind. One moment that stands out to me was when Tom's defense attorney tried to discredit my testimony. He questioned my memory, tried to make it seem like I was just a confused young girl who didn't really understand what had happened. It was in that moment that I realized how important my voice was. I had to stand firm, to show the world that I knew exactly what happened, and that Tom couldn't just manipulate his way out of this. The trial was not just about seeking justice for what had happened to me. It was about every woman, every child who had ever felt powerless, who had been made to feel like their pain didn't matter. I wasn't just fighting for myself, I was fighting for all of them. As the days went by, the trial became more and more intense. There were moments when I wanted to walk out of the courtroom and never look back. The truth, as painful as it was finally out in the open. There were moments when I broke down, when the weight of it all became too much to bear. But every time I felt like I couldn't go on, I looked at my mother. Her eyes were full of the same determination I felt within myself. She hadn't given up on me, and I couldn't give up now. One of the hardest moments of the trial was when the medical examiner presented the evidence of Tom's abuse. The bruises, the scars, the broken bones. Each photo was a reminder of the terror we had lived through. It was hard to look at them, but I knew I had to. It wasn't just my story anymore. It was the story of every person who had been abused and ignored, silenced and pushed aside. When it was Tom's turn to speak, I felt the room tense up. He didn't seem remorseful at all. His defense was that he was sick, that his actions were a result of his addiction. While I could acknowledge that addiction is a terrible thing, I also knew that it was no excuse for what he had done to us. I couldn't allow him to play the victim. He was the one who had chosen this path, the one who had hurt us, and he needed to be held accountable. The trial lasted for weeks, but in the end, the jury found Tom guilty of all charges. The relief I felt when the verdict was read aloud was overwhelming. It was as if a heavy weight had been lifted from my shoulders. Tom would be held responsible for his actions, and I could finally begin to heal. The hardest part of the trial, however, was seeing my mother's face when the sentence was read. As much as we had suffered at his hands, she had always loved him. For her, this wasn't just a trial for justice. It was a trial for the man she had once loved, for the father of her child, for the husband she had once believed in. I could see the pain in her eyes, but I also saw a glimmer of relief. She had finally been able to make him face the consequences of his actions. The trial ended with Tom being sentenced to 25 years in prison. He would be held accountable for the crimes he had committed against us, and I finally felt like I could take back control of my life. But even with that sense of justice, I knew that the healing process would be long. The scars Tom had left would never fully disappear. As I left the courthouse, I looked at my mother, and we silently held hands. It was the first time in a long time that we both felt like we had found a way out of the darkness. The journey hadn't been easy, but it was ours, and we were stronger for having walked it together. Justice had been served, but for me this wasn't just about punishment. It was about healing. It was about knowing that I was no longer bound by the past, that the future could be mine to shape. I had faced the hardest truth of my life, and I had survived it. Now it was time to rebuild one step at a time. The days after the trial were filled with a sense of relief, but also a deep, lingering exhaustion. For years my life had been defined by fear, uncertainty, and the weight of memories I never asked for. But now, with Tom locked away and justice finally served, I found myself standing at a crossroads, one that, for the first time in my life, felt like it was entirely mine to navigate. The first few months were the hardest. I remember the silence that seemed to fill our house after the trial, the absence of Tom's shadow hanging over us. It was strange, almost like the world had paused for a moment and given me a chance to breathe again. I couldn't help but look around and realize how much I had missed in the last few years, moments of peace, quiet, and normalcy. Things that others took for granted were now treasures to me. Living with my mother, Helen, was both comforting and painful. She had been my anchor, my strength throughout everything. I watched as she struggled to find her own footing too. I saw how she had hidden her pain for so many years, how she had pushed through for me, and how much of herself she had given up in the process. Now, with Tom gone and the chaos of our lives settling, it was time for both of us to heal. But that meant confronting the trauma that had shaped us. Helen, though, was never one to back down. Her love for me, her determination to protect me, had never wavered, even in the darkest of times. She started going to therapy, something she had never considered before. For so long, she had tried to handle everything herself, but she finally realized that it was okay to seek help. Watching her take this step made me realize that healing wasn't just about surviving. It was about living again, about finding peace in the midst of everything that had happened. As for me, the process of rebuilding my life wasn't something that happened overnight. There were days when I felt paralyzed by the memories, days when I could barely muster the strength to get out of bed. But slowly, I started to reclaim parts of myself that I had long forgotten. I began spending more time with friends, reconnecting with old ones who had always been there for me, even when I had pushed them away. I found solace in the little things: a walk in the park, a cup of tea with someone who truly listened, a quiet evening at home without the constant fear that had once plagued me. For the first time in years, I felt the stirrings of something I hadn't realized I had lost: hope. It was fragile at first, like a small flicker in the dark, but it was there, and it grew stronger each day. One of the most significant steps in my healing came when I decided to return to school. It had been a dream of mine for as long as I could remember, but with everything that had happened, I had never believed it was possible. When I walked into the community college for the first time after the trial, it felt like I was stepping into a new world. The building seemed overwhelming, the faces of the students unfamiliar, and the weight of my past felt heavy on my shoulders. But there was something inside me, something that had been buried deep down, that told me I couldn't give up now. Not when I had come this far. I enrolled in a basic English course at first just to get my feet wet, but even that was a struggle. I had spent so many years holding everything in, keeping my head down, and now I had to confront my own voice. My confidence had been shattered, but with every paper I wrote, with every word I spoke in class, I began to see small pieces of the person I used to be, the person I was becoming again. It wasn't easy, but it felt like the most important thing I had ever done. In the evenings when I wasn't studying or spending time with Helen, I started to take up hobbies again. Things like knitting, which my grandmother had taught me, or reading books that I had once loved but had put aside in the chaos of my life. It was as if I was rediscovering parts of myself that I had buried in the dark corners of my mind. These small acts of reclaiming my time and energy helped me realize that I had control over my future, that I could decide what kind of life I wanted to build moving forward. The first real breakthrough for me came when I started volunteering at a local shelter for women. It wasn't an easy decision. I was afraid of opening old wounds, of facing the reality of what I had been through. But something inside me told me that helping others who had gone through similar experiences would not only help them, it would help me too. And it did. Working with the women at the shelter, I found a sense of purpose that I had long been missing. Their stories, their struggles, their courage in the face of unimaginable hardship reminded me of my own strength. It was through helping them that I was able to finally let go of the anger that had consumed me for so long. I didn't have to carry the weight of my past anymore. I could use it to help others, to make sure that their voices were heard, and that they too could find a way to rebuild their lives. It wasn't until I met someone in the shelter who had gone through a similar experience that I began to feel a sense of healing that was deeper than just surface-level recovery. Her name was Sarah, and she had been through so much in her own life. We started talking, and I found myself sharing things I hadn't said to anyone else. She had been through the same thing, the same kind of manipulation, the same kind of fear, and yet, here she was stronger than ever, rebuilding her life just like I was. Sarah became my closest friend, and over time, I realized that the most important thing I could do for myself was to let go of the past. The past would always be there, but it didn't have to define who I was anymore. With Sarah's support, and the support of other women in the shelter, I began to see that my future was mine to create, and that there was more to life than just survival. By the time I finished my first semester of school, I felt like a different person. The woman who walked into that classroom months earlier was not the same woman who walked out. I had found my voice again, and I had found the courage to speak up, not just for myself but for others who needed to be heard too. One of the most powerful moments in this entire journey came when I realized that my past, as painful as it was, had given me the strength to help others. The healing process wasn't just about me. It was about every person who had ever suffered in silence, who had been made to feel like they didn't matter, who had been hurt by someone they loved. It was about lifting each other up, sharing our stories, and making sure that the cycle of abuse stopped with us. I began speaking at community events, telling my story to anyone who would listen. At first, it felt terrifying to stand in front of a room full of people and share my experiences. But every time I did, I felt a little bit more free, a little bit more whole. And with each person who came up to me afterward, sharing their own story or thanking me for my words, I realized that this was my purpose. I was no longer the scared little girl who had been trapped by the man who should have loved her. I was a woman who had survived, who had learned, and who was using her story to change the world. Today, as I sit here on this porch watching the world go by, I can honestly say that I am at peace. I have rebuilt my life from the ground up, and though there are scars, they are not the first thing people see when they look at me. They see strength, they see resilience, and they see a woman who is no longer afraid to speak her truth. It wasn't an easy journey, but it was a necessary one. Because rebuilding a life is never about erasing the past. It's about using it to build something better, something stronger, and something that allows you to walk forward with your head held high. And that, my dear friends, is what I've done.